Hello, you legendary people. Welcome to or welcome back to Lauren's Legends. This story today was requested by my friend James, and it is a deep dive into the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. There are 8 people attacked, only 3 survive, and this true story has inspired several cult classics like the 1970s movie of the town that dreaded sundown. You have the Texas Chainsaw Massacres and the Halloween movies. And a small disclaimer to start with, we are going to be talking a lot about people passing away and many different forms of abuse. So if that's not your thing, feel free to click out right now. And if not, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Texarkana was a beautiful, peaceful little town that was a mix of urban and a mix of the country. And half of it is in Texas and the other half of it is in Arkansas. On the evening of February 22nd, 1946, Jimmy Hollis, who was 25, and his girlfriend, Mary Jean Larry, who was 19, had just left a movie theater. It was Friday night, and the pair wanted to continue spending time together. And remember, this was back in the day, way before the Netflix and chill era. So what couples would do at night when they wanted some privacy is they would find what's called lovers' lanes. And these are dark roads out in the country that you could go and just hang out. Jimmy knew of a secluded road that was right past some houses outside of town, and around 11:45 they parked the car. About 10 minutes pass and the couple, they start canoodling. As this was going on, suddenly a bright light shone right in the driver's side window, and Jimmy, thinking it was either a prank or maybe they were looking for someone else, said, "Hey man, you got the wrong guy." All the while, a concerned Mary clutched Jimmy's arm. The man that was standing there holding the flashlight then said to him, "Hey man, I don't want to kill you, so do what I say." And he made both of them crawl out the driver's side door. Once they were outside of the vehicle, the panic then began to set in because they were no longer blinded by the bright light and they could see clearly a man standing in front of them with what looked like a pillowcase on his head where he had cut the eyes out, and he was standing there holding a gun. The man then orders Jimmy to take his pants off, and he begins to hesitate. But Mary was like, no, just comply with whatever he tells us to do. So as Jimmy goes to take his pants off, Mary hears these 2 huge bangs, and she thinks a gun's gone off. Terrified, Mary thinks that this man was there to rob them and now it's going wrong. So she reaches down and grabs his pants, and she grabs his wallet and she's opening it up, showing him that there's no money in it. The man then just hits Mary over the head with the butt of his gun. When she was on the ground, she was stunned, and the man demanded that she stand up. And as soon as she did, he told her to run. And she listened. She ran and she started going towards a ditch, and the man tells her to stop and go in the opposite direction, and he was having fun with this. So Mary goes and she's running, and in front of her she sees a parked car. So she goes directly up to the car, not realizing that it's abandoned, and also not realizing that her attacker has been running after her this whole time, hunting her down. And she also didn't think about the fact that this was probably his car. The man caught up with her, and he grabbed her and he turned her around really quick, and he said, "Why are you running?" And she replied, "Because you told me to." And he yells, "Liar!" and proceeds to hit her again. As she falls to the ground, he rips off her clothes and begins assaulting her with the barrel of his gun until a car's headlights shone directly towards them, and he panicked and spooked and ran away from her. As soon as he started running away from her, Mary jumped up and grabbed her clothes and began bolting to the nearest house, which was about half a mile away. And as soon as she gets there, she's banging and banging and banging on the door and wakes this family up. I mean, this is 12 or after midnight at this point, and they allow her in, seeing that she's injured, and they call the police. While all this was happening, Jimmy actually regained consciousness. What Mary had heard with those two loud bangs was the gun hitting his head so hard that it was cracking his skull. So this extremely injured, bloody, and very disorientated Jimmy starts walking, and he's able to walk up towards the road as a vehicle is driving down and sees him. And the vehicle does stop, and Jimmy starts telling him what's going on. The vehicle, or the person in the vehicle, was a little bit scared because this person is all bloody and everything in front of him. So he doesn't let Jimmy get in the vehicle, but he does go to the nearest payphone, and he also calls the police. Finally, after 30 minutes of waiting, the police finally get to the scene, and they're able to get Mary and Jimmy both to the hospital. Mary stays the night for her wounds. Poor Jimmy was in there for several days with having several cracks to his skull. While they were in the hospital, they were obviously both questioned about the events that had transpired that night. And their stories were very similar as they were telling them. You know, both of them said the whole series of events the same way. And they both said that the man was tall. He was at least 6 foot tall. But there was one small discrepancy that really changed the way the police investigated this. Mary stated that she believed it was a light-skinned African-American man, and Jimmy believed that it was a very tan white man. And that small discrepancy created distrust with the police, and they started thinking that these young people might have known the perpetrator, even though poor Mary had been attacked this horribly, and they start thinking that they're covering for them and not telling the police everything. So basically, in the end, the police didn't really do much of anything in this situation. They did not arrest anybody, and to our knowledge, they didn't even question anybody. On the morning of March 24th, a motorist was driving down US Highway 67. He then turned off on a road that was commonly known as a lover's lane, and he sees a car parked there. It's early in the morning. This is a very odd time for a car to still just be parked on the side of the road there. So as he gets closer, he's curious, and he kind of can see someone in there that looks like they're sleeping. So he decides to investigate and be curious, and he gets closer and sees a sight that he would never, ever be able to forget. This motorist goes as fast as he can to a phone, obviously phones the police, and when the police get there and they're getting closer to the vehicle, it's pouring rain, and they can see a massive pool of blood right beside the car that the rain is quickly trying its best to wash away. When they look inside of the vehicle, they can see Richard Griffin, who was 29 at the time, laying very strangely in the middle of the two front seats. And he was in a kneeling pose, but he had his head on his crossed hands, and his pockets of his pants had all been turned outside, like a robbery where they're trying to go through the pockets for anything valuable. They then see Polly Ann Moore, who is only 17, and they had been dating for about 6 weeks at the time, and she was laying face down, kind of sprawled out on the back seat, but she was fully clothed, and her pockets were also turned out. The scene was incredibly graphic. There was blood that was seeping on the floorboard of the cars, so much so that it had actually started seeping out of the bottom of the doors. The police were surveying the scene. They were trying to add up everything that they were witnessing, and they also did find a .32 caliber casing that had been discharged, obviously, when he had shot the victims. Due to the huge blood puddle outside of the car, the police believed that both victims had been shot there and then placed back inside of the vehicle. Both victims had been shot in the back of their heads. Richard had been shot twice, and Polly had been shot once. Their bodies were taken away, and there was supposed to be a pathology report done on them, but there was some kind of mishap at where they had been taken, and it was not done. And many people believed that Polly had been assaulted as well, but they never did anything to get that evidence. Over the next 3 weeks, the police did investigate this, but they thought it was an isolated, random attack. When Mary Larry heard about this incident, she immediately went to the police station. She wanted to be helpful. She wanted to find this person who had done horrible things to her, and she just knew in her gut it was the same person that had done this to them. And when she got there, the police began questioning her again, still thinking that she was keeping information from them. As they were investigating, the police were not getting anywhere. They were not getting any leads or valid tips to be able to investigate it, and they did call in the Texas Rangers. I immediately thought Chuck Norris, and I was like, no, they didn't bring in Chuck Norris. I wish they would have solved it. So far, at this point, the city had remained calm. They were definitely starting to look over their shoulders a little bit more, but the panic had not set in. That was until the morning of April 14th. At 6:30 a.m., the body of Paul Martin, only 17, was found lying on his left side on North Park Road. Police arrived to find that there was blood on both sides of the road and on the other side of the fence. Poor Paul looked like he had been shot while he had been running away from his attacker. He had been shot 4 times. It looked as though the first shot that had gone through his arm was when he was running, and then he had another one that entered into his back and then went into his ribs. And then on towards the other side of the road, he had one that was in the back of his neck, which dropped him, and it looked like the attacker had gone up, turned his body over, and shot him directly through his nose. Once the police began contacting friends and family and letting them know that they had found him, they found out that the previous night he had picked up Betty Jo Booker, only 15, from her musical performance that she had been putting on that night. She played the saxophone, and it was a big production, and he had picked her up, and they had been hanging out that night. And no one had seen her either. This immediately created panic, and they wasted no time in getting search parties together to go find her. Around 11:30 that morning, a search party had been looking through a nearby park. This park was about 2 miles away from where Paul's body had been, but they had to expand it so far. And one of the search members found Betty Jo lying behind a tree at the park. She looked like she had been posed. She was lying on her back, and her right hand was in the pocket of her buttoned-up coat. She had clearly been shot twice. Once had been directly in the chest, and once had been directly in the face. Strangely, Paul's car was found 3 miles from Betty Jo and almost 1.5 miles from Paul, and the keys were still in the ignition of the vehicle. Now, after this happened, they were bringing in the cavalry, and they brought in the captain of the Texas Rangers, and his name was Manuel Gonzalez. He became somewhat of their unwanted spokesman. He was described as being an attention seeker, and unfortunately, instead of calming the public, he liked to rile them up by telling them to keep their guns oiled. At his first press conference, he alerted the public that Betty Jo and Paul had put up a terrific struggle, and it was confirmed that Betty Jo had been assaulted, and it was strange because, again, she was fully clothed, so he had been putting the clothes back on them, and they had also been killed by the same weapon as the last. And now he informed them that there was a serial killer on the loose. After this attack and after this press conference, There was mass hysteria in Texarkana. They brought in the FBI. They brought in everybody who wanted to come in, and they were investigating every single lead. They actually arrested 200 people and found out that they were, all had alibis. And they also investigated about 200 false leads as well. They were literally bringing suspects in from over 100 miles away to question. When this was going on, the rumors began running rampant. And it was everything from they had caught the guy was the son of a local rich man, and that the police were covering for him, and that he was in so-and-so jail, they should storm it. So Gonzalez got a whole press conference together on April 18th to say, no, we have not caught the guy. It is still very dangerous out there. There is still someone who is hunting people. You need to be prepared. We're not hiding anything. We have not caught the guy. He also again reminded the public to arm themselves and to protect their family at whatever cost was needed. So all of the stores in the area were running out of all of their guns, all of their ammunition, any kind of trap that you can imagine, all of the locks. And when they were out of all of their stock, salesmen were actually traveling from all over the country to bring protection equipment into this tiny little town, and that way people could protect themselves. When police would go to a scene of the crime, they would always have to go with their lights on, so that way they were announcing that it was the police and that it was safe. There was a bar owner who had just closed up, and a man simply walked in wanting a beer, and the bar owner shot him. He did not know, he just didn't think, and he was protecting it. I don't know what happened to that guy. That's not part of the main part of the story, but it just shows the crazy panic that was running through this entire town. A curfew was put into place, and you had your own vigilantes that were going around with their guns patrolling the street along with the police officers. Captain Gonzalez got several teenagers together to act as decoys and to go sit on these lover lanes and cars late at night with police officers hiding around the area, watching them, trying to bait out this phantom killer and arrest him. They also had police officers that would sit in cars with mannequins and have wigs on the mannequins to try to bait him out. They also went to the park that Betty Jo had been found in, and there would be 6 different officers just standing behind the trees all night looking to see anybody out there walking around that shouldn't be. I mean, just complete chaos in this little town. About 3 weeks go by, the chaos has not calmed, and nobody has still been arrested. On Friday evening, May 3rd, Virgil Starks, who was 37, and his wife Katie, who was 36, were beginning to wind down and start to get ready for bed. They lived in a cute farmhouse that sat on 500 acres of land on the Arkansas side of Texarkana, right off Highway 67. Katie had just laid down in her bed, and she could hear Virgil's soft music playing downstairs from his record player as he was sitting in his beloved chair reading his newspaper. Suddenly, she heard very loud glass breaking, so she jumps out of bed, she runs downstairs, and she turns the corner just in time to see Virgil go to stand up, and then he slumps back in his chair. She could see the blood, and she just instinctively knew that he was dead. In a panic, having no idea what was going on, she turned to run to the wall where the old crank phone, the ones that you have to go round and round that, kids these days would have no idea how to work. And she grabbed it, it rang twice, and then she was shot twice in the face. One shot went in her cheek and went out by her ear, and the other one went in and was lodged under her tongue. She collapsed to the ground, but quickly picked herself up and was going to go into the other room and grab her pistol, still having no idea who she was fighting and what was this, but she went to protect herself. But the blood was so heavy on her eyes that she couldn't see, and then she heard the killer going to their back screen door trying to break in. When she heard that, she did not hesitate at all. She jumped up and ran out the front door barefoot, knowing the way to her sister's house by, she could do it with her eyes closed. And it was right over the highway on the other side of it. So she's running as fast as she can. She gets over there and bangs on the door. And her sister and her brother-in-law weren't home. So she had to go off their front porch. And she's going to the next house where the neighbor was actually on their porch and they could see her coming. And she runs up to him. And as she gets there, she collapsed, saying he's dead as she passes out. The neighbor, a good old Arkansas, Texas, person, his warning to his other neighbor that he needed help was to grab his rifle and fired it a couple times. So the other neighbor runs out and sees this horrible situation unfolding before him and helps the neighbor get her in the vehicle. And this woman was so tough and strong that as she's in the car, she regains consciousness. She pulls her gold tooth out that had been shot and broken up and tries to offer it to them as payment for taking her to the hospital. And they're like, no, you can keep that. We'll take you without your tooth. Thank you, though. Appreciate it. When Katie is taken to the hospital, she was able to be saved. And poor thing, I can't imagine what she went through. Her jaw was broken, just shattered. And the police did go and question her. She was able to tell them as much as she could, even though, it was very hard for her to speak. And so the police went back to the scene and they found Virgil. The scene was just absolutely barbaric. They were able to find out that the shooter had been standing outside the house and had shot him twice in the head through the window, and also was in the same vantage point when he had shot her when she was at the telephone. As they're going through and looking at everything in the living room, they saw where you could tell that someone had taken their fingers in Virgil's blood and had smeared it, almost like they were playing with their handiwork. The police were able to also find another cartridge and see that this one did not match the other two sets of murders that had been done thus far. So they began to think that these were not connected. And also, this was a married couple that was a little bit older than the people that he had been targeting before. So they also thought maybe that this was someone else. Not taking any chances, though. They put up roadblocks all over Highway 67. They continue to bring in more and more people into the entire huge investigation that they were working on. And at one point, there was actually 47 investigators that were investigating the murders alone. Like, that was their only job, was this, to find out who was doing this. They also brought in another 20 Arkansas policemen into Texarkana, both sides. Like, they were able to go over the line. That brought 10 more patrol cars that could go out into the streets and patrol. They released many statements warning that the killer had a 3-week cooling off period and then was striking again. He was going after couples, men and women, that were out late night or in a house now. Those weren't safe either. And that every night a murder had occurred, a car had been stolen. Now, poor Mary Larry, my heart goes out to her. She was still so frustrated and irate about this whole situation, and she wanted to do anything she could to try to find the man that had violated her. Seeing that this was now reaching countrywide, on May 10th, she sat down with the Texarkana Gazette. And when the article was published the next day, the police finally connected her assault with the other cases that had been happening. Through the entire summer of 1946, this entire city was still in a state of panic. When the 3 weeks came around, they were just waiting for someone to be struck and taken out. And it didn't come. And there was never any more killings again. Dr. Anthony LaPaula, a psychologist analyst, released his profile of the killer. He believed that the killer would continue his attacks on the outskirts of the town. And he believed that this killer was the killer of all 5 of the victims. He believed that the MO was close enough that it was the same man in all of them. He also believed that the man was in his mid-30s to early 50s, and that he was motivated by sex and he was a sadist. Throughout this crazy investigation, over 1,000 people were questioned. Over 400 people in total were arrested, all finding out that the evidence did not prove that they were it. And 9 people falsely confessed only to be proven that they didn't do it. There are so many suspects that were good suspects in this story that if I were to go through them and explain them all to you, we would be here until next year. So the biggest ones that I will go through is a lot of people through history have said the Zodiac killer. You know, they did have the same kind of, like, they were shooting their victims. It was couples, things like that. But there were so many other things that weren't consistent. And if we were to go by how old the police believed the Zodiac killer was when he was active, he would have only been 10 at the time. I think we can rule him out. So there's several others. There was a shifty man that was trying to sell a saxophone. Remember Betty Jo, when she was killed, her saxophone went missing. And this guy went into a pawn shop. And when the girl said, "Hang on, let me get my manager," he ran out. That was a whole thing. There was also this crazy hitchhiker that got into somebody's car that apparently pulled a gun on them, but it wasn't proven. There was a man that was found dead on train tracks, and they believed that he was either a victim, but then that changed, so they thought that he was the perpetrator and that he had unalived himself because of guilt from it. There was also a man who had been having an affair with a married woman who he had pulled off on the side of the road to urinate, and he was being sneaky, so that's why he pulled where he did. Little did he know he was pulling by where one of the murders had happened, and the police the next day had found his tire tracks, and they arrested him. And he was like, "Guys, I was just peeing. I promise I didn't kill anybody." And they had to let him go because he had an alibi with the married lady. There was a taxi driver that happened to be around the scene when every single thing happened, but he was obviously just working and he was released. And then there was an Army Air Force machine gunner who he was having some mental issues. He was having some problems and really needed help. And he had been having like fugue states where he would wake up and believe that he was running from someone or something. He actually went to the police department and said, "I think I'm the one who did all of this." And the police had to prove him wrong and show him that, no, you were not in the area when this happened. Poor guy. So with all of these, there are 2 that I am actually going to go through. One of them, I highly doubt it is the person, but there are some weird coincidences. I feel like it's worth it enough to go through. And then there's one that I think is the person who did it all. Henry Booker Tennyson unalived himself when he was 18 and was a college student. And there is a lot of information on this one, but I'm just going to hit the bullet points. He left behind a note that confessed to being the killer and said, if you had done what I had done, you would unalive yourself too. The only reason I bring this guy up and I want to talk about him is due to the fact that he was connected to each victim. Now, in the grand scheme of things, it was a small town. I think there was 30,000 people total that lived in it, in the entire area. But he had gone to school with Betty Jo and actually had been in the same orchestra class that she was in. He was working at the theater when the first couple, Jimmy and Mary, had gone to that movie that night. But again, I do think that those are all just crazy coincidences. And at the time of the killings, he would have been only 16. Doesn't mean he couldn't have done it, but the killer was too good. He was never caught. He never left behind evidence. That is not typically what you would see of a 16-year-old. And after his death, his brother came out and said, hey, we were here this night when the Starks situation happened with Virgil and Katie. There's no way. He probably claimed that when he unalived himself to get, attention that he might have been seeking while he was alive. So, the person that I believe did it, remember, every single night that a murder had occurred, and even the attack on Mary and Jimmy had happened, a car had been stolen. Well, there was a police officer that was specifically investigating car theft. And he found out when he went back through his notes that on the night that Richard and Polly were killed, there was a stolen car that had been found close to the scene. And there was another car that had been stolen close to that scene, same night. So it was as if the killer got there in a stolen car and left that vehicle behind only to steal another one as his getaway. This officer was able to locate one of the stolen cars that he was looking for, and he posted up and watched the car until Miss Peggy Swiney walked over and got in the vehicle. She was arrested immediately, and when she got to the police station, Miss Peggy had no problems at first talking and confessing a lot about her husband. Her husband was an infamous man with the police officers. His name was Yule Swiney, and he was 29, and he was a very well-known car thief and counterfeiter. Peggy had come straight out and told the police that her husband was the Phantom Killer, and she had let details out that only the police knew. They never come out and say every single detail, and it was very interesting that she knew that information. But as soon as they started interviewing her further, she started changing her story with every single interview that was done after that. The police believed that she was either scared of Yule or she was scared of incriminating herself in everything that had happened. The police were able to verify some of her information that she had given, but the biggest problem was it was all circumstantial, and she was the biggest part of the case. And when she stopped wanting to talk, the problem was they couldn't force herself to testify against her husband. But the good news is this cop wasn't going to let this go. So this cop found out that Yule had been over in Orlando, Florida, because he had stolen a car in Texas and had taken it to Florida to try to sell it. So the police go all the way over to Florida and they arrest him. They catch him. The weird thing, though, is when they went to put him in handcuffs and they were telling him that he was being arrested for the car theft, he said, "Man, don't play with me. You know it's for more than that." And the officer said, "No." And he goes, "Am I going to get the electric chair?" And he said, "Why?" And then he stopped talking. So very strange. When they get him back, they still were never able to get anything more than circumstantial to be able to charge him with the 5 deaths. But in a good course of events, he did still have to spend 26 years in prison for all the car thefts that he had committed. Whew, this was a long one. Do you agree with me and think that it was Yule Swiney was the one who committed all this? And how horrific. I can't imagine living in this town during all of this going on. Please let me know what you think of everything in the comment section down below. As always, thank you so much for watching. My last video I did, I let you know that I'm trying to grow, and the response that I got from y'all was overwhelmingly wonderful, and it really touched my heart. I appreciate you all so much. Thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day. I'll see you next time.